All right, so I think you can see the screen now.
Yes.
So
Looks good.
in the program, I have a link to my presentation also. And if you prefer to like see detailed slides instead of like overview information slides, all of my speaker notes have like a lot of information on them. So you can follow along with that if you open up from the program, the link next to the talk name. And also I have links, so I have a bunch of screenshots of my wiki, and I have links to those pages also in the speaker notes. So you can open those if you from the Google Drive link if you want to see it. So I'm talking about cargo and Lua best practices and when not to use them. And it turns out that a lot of the time you don't want to do stuff that normally you would want to do. So I'll be talking about that a little bit. My name is Megan. I go by River in the esports community. I'm the lead admin for Leaguepedia, and I also do. So I'm a contractor for Fandom Gamepedia, so I'm like kind of a consultant, I guess, for other Gamepedia wikis that use cargo. So pretty much anytime a Gamepedia wiki wants to do something with cargo, I help them out with it. And so even though most of what I do is for my wiki, I've seen like a lot of other use cases, and I've also had to work with a lot of admins who, I was talking to Yaron about this when we were doing the special cargo tables interface stuff yesterday and the day before, that one of the most common things people say is, I'm scared I'm going to break it. And so I guess some of what I'm talking about is why you should be scared that you're going to break it. But then I'm also going to try and say, well, sometimes you don't actually have to worry about it. Sometimes it's okay to just ignore the best practices and do whatever's easiest. So I'm going to first start out with just a quick overview of kind of the things that you can do with Cargo and Lua. I have only one extension on my wiki that I wrote myself. Everything else that you see is built entirely through a combination of Cargo, Lua, a little bit of DPL. There's gadgets and widgets and stuff, but everything is like quote unquote standard extensions, and the only extension that I wrote that's non-standard has nothing to do with anything you see on the wiki. It's for tying Python scripts into checking logs to have Python scripts do stuff. So you can really do a lot. This is a screenshot of the front page, and you can see that we have this like normal flat box here with information, and when you hover a team, you get a pop-up, and then when you click a button, you get a pop-up of their schedule. And so all of the match information there is handled through a database, and then I can just on demand query all of this information and display it in any format you want. And then I'm going to go quickly through a couple of screenshots. So starting with this screenshot, everything else that I'm going to show you is from the same single source of truth about roster changes and news. So there's a parent table called news, and then a bunch of children tables that are one-to-one or many-to-one with this parent table to have types of news. So you can see most of these are roster changes, and then there's the ability to put news items without any semantic information attached to them, but I'll talk about that more later. Anyway, this is mostly just to show you the versatility of what you can do with Cargo and Lua. So you have sentences. Okay, sorry, my mouse is too scrolly. You have sentences here, more sentences. This is what time you're filtering by a player. Here, you're filtering by recent news on the front page. And then here, this is still the same database table that was creating those sentence timelines, is now creating this information that looks much more like a database. And then you can see again, when you click the reference, the sentence is actually attached to it. And when you click the button here, again, you can do a query that's going to pull up the entire history here. And then the history here is also part of the same database. And then here, there's a crazy module that I don't want to think about after I wrote it that combines the information. And so you have one roster change here and another roster change here, and they're associated because it's the same player leaving a team and then joining a team. And then also, this is the team history on a player page. You get the other direction. So this is from when they join to when they leave, and this is leaving to join. So this is the time that they spend in between teams, and this is the time that they spend on the team. So again, you have just the single source of truth database, and then you're able to combine the information in the two ways like that. And this is what the data entry looks like. So you have an item, which is a roster change data, and you give it a pre with a link of a list of players and a post with a list of players. And you can see that the data entry representation of the data has actually nothing to do with any of the display representations of the data. You might notice the lack of a sentence here. There's no English that has to be input here unless you want to do just a free sentence that has anything you want. And instead, I have all of these keys. So this is a screenshot from the documentation page. The key is associated to a sentence. This is a small screenshot. There's probably about 50 keys available. And then here's the information for how you set a key. So there's some flags that it can do. Occasionally it falls back to you actually physically tell it, this is the move type, and then it'll write the appropriate sentence. But most of the time it tries to guess. So it tries to just say, okay, you give me the information about the players before the change and the information about the players after the change, and we'll store this in a database. And the way that it stores is actually completely different from the user interface version of it. And then the way it stores is also completely different from most of the displays of it. And this is, again, all done with Cargo and Lua. So it's incredibly powerful what you can do with these two extensions. So I guess the first best practice that I would say is if you're doing stuff with Cargo, you should be using Lua. And even if you're not doing anything like this on day one, the first module that I wrote was pretty much, it was like wiki text concatenated with like 2 if statements or something. And it was terrible. I rewrote it probably 5 times since then. But it's okay. That's okay, because you started out with Lua and then eventually you can build stuff like this. And you can do it without all of the hassle of having to update extensions as MediaWiki versions change, which is really nice. Okay, so I'm going to talk very briefly about data storage paradigms. There's a lot more information in the slides again if you want to read it after. This was something I talked about last year, so I'm not going to go too much in depth. So how do you store data that you have on the wiki? And you can store stuff in data modules like this. So you can see that here's key value pairs. The key is one-trick ponies here, and the value is this array of information about, or a dictionary, I guess, of information about the team one-trick ponies. Pros of this are that you don't need to learn Cargo. It's a lot faster to retrieve information from like this, from data that's entered like this, because there's no database query. So I can look up stuff in this module maybe 1,000 times on one page, although I do some additional caching, and it doesn't matter. And most relevant to the topics that I'm going to talk about today is that entities don't need pages. So it doesn't matter if I have a page for one-trick ponies or not. It doesn't matter if I have a page for 13 Noobs Gaming. I probably do not have a team for that, or a page for that team. And that can be really helpful for reasons that I'm going to talk about in a bit. But cons are that access is limited to Lua. You have to write some stuff to be able to retrieve this information in wiki text, and it's hidden. How do you get to this random module page if you're an editor? So the default way to store stuff, in my opinion, is that you do it in Cargo. I know that you can do things that are not Cargo. SMW obviously is the big one. I am not a fan of SMW, and I'm not going to talk about it at all beyond saying that. I have worked with SMW a bunch for about 3 years. And then there's other extensions that I have not used, like Wikibase and external data. So I'm just not going to talk about those because I've never worked with them. And SMW I'm not talking about because I don't like it. I'm sorry. So this is pretty much how I would say is the best way to default to storing stuff, is that you have a Cargo store, and then note that the Cargo store is inside of the include only. And so you just store the stuff pretty straightforward, goes into a database. And just when you're looking at stuff like this, it's pretty similar in complexity to SMW. And the additional functionality gets amplified when you do queries. But it is important to store your data in a way so that queries are easy to do. So you can also store initially in Lua and then store to cargo later, which I did on a wiki, on a Gamepedia wiki. You can see that the storing of the made from here in the template code is the invoke of this, and then the raw data is in the module. And I don't want to spend too long on this. You can store stuff nowhere. If you just want to import stuff from an external source, that's okay. We also do this on the wiki. It's great for historical information. If you have, in this case, there's a Google Doc that Riot Games maintains, and they don't have any history of it publicly or privately that I know of, other than Google's default, which is, again, is not public at all. So every day we just back it up, and so there's a history for the past 2 years of this document. So there's no database here. We just, or the database is external, and we just import it. And that can be a good way to do stuff, especially if you want to host static historical data on the wiki and have it available. And eventually you would add it to cargo. But it's okay to just put this wiki or this data on the wiki. I do have queries of that, but like the actual information on the page is just lives on the page forever. And then there's like metadata about the page that gets queried. I'm going the wrong way. Okay, and then you can also store stuff in wiki text. This is by far the lowest barrier to entry of doing stuff. The only thing you need to know is how to do a switch statement. And then you just return whatever the switch gives you. The obvious advantage is this is really easy to do. Anyone can figure it out. The disadvantage is that you can't really do anything except retrieve a single value. And you would be pulling a lot of teeth to do anything complicated with this. So cargo. So I'm going to talk a little bit about SQL best practices and what it means for cargo. So I'm just going to go over relatively quickly a couple of SQL terms. So the first one is the primary key, and the intuition behind a primary key is that it's a kind of lowest common denominator way of identifying a data line hopefully in a way that semantically makes sense. So for example, if you have a player, the name of the player is probably the primary key. But if players have more than one name, or if they like change name, or if there are two players with the same name, then that doesn't work. So maybe you would do a combination of the player's first name plus their real life name. In esports, you play under a handle, so I guess the name would be the handle. So it can be, you can think that there's an obvious answer of, oh, the name of the player is the primary key, but actually the page name of the player is the primary key, because you can have disambiguation pages. But do not use the field page name, and actually you should never, ever use the field page name for anything unless it's literally to get a link to the place where the data was saved. And the reason for this is that if you do that, then you're permanently coupling your entire database to the exact page-by-page layout of your entire wiki. So if one day you're storing stuff on an employees page, and then you decide to make a subpage called employees/projects, and then you want to store all of this stuff on the projects subpage, suddenly page name is different. And maybe before you were joining to another table based on the page name, which is the employee's name, but that's not true anymore because it's on a subpage. So it's okay to use the name of the page as a primary key, but you need to make a separate field that is static. So basically just wrap the field page name and have two fields that are identical, which again, this is a case where in SQL, you wouldn't want to do that. That would be considered pretty denormalized. But in cargo, that's great, because you don't want to use page name. So And it's okay for a primary key to have more than one, to correspond to more than one data column. For example, the primary key of a roster change, a player joining or leaving a team would be considered a roster change. A primary key might be the date it happened, combined with the player who did it, and combined with the team. Because maybe a player leaves one team and joins another in the same day. So just having the player and the date isn't enough. A team could change multiple players, so the date and the team isn't enough. And a player could join one team, leave that team, join another team, and then leave that team and then go back to the first team. So just the team and the player also isn't enough. So you need all three of those values. And maybe something crazy happens and a player's on a team for one day. And so then you're like, all right, well, I need to add yet another thing into my primary key. And I guess that's just going to be indexed within the page that we save it, which I'll show you in a bit. So that's primary keys. Cargo uses primary keys because it uses SQL, and SQL makes you have primary keys, but you never actually see them. So it's something that you probably wouldn't know about unless you either are listening to this talk or went out of your way to learn SQL theory or already knew it. But I think it's important to know that it exists, even if you never have to directly interact with them, because whenever you join tables, you're excuse me, you're going to be joining a table to another based on a primary key. And so you have to have a primary key stored somewhere. And because you can't, I guess in the most recent version, you can join on more than one field. So if you upgraded Cargo in the past month, you can join on more than one field. But if you have an older version of Cargo, then sometimes you might have to concatenate 3 fields into 3 separate values into a single field to be able to have that unique join on field value. So then the second thing is that I'm going to talk about for SQL background is normal forms. This is a theoretical thing that is, excuse me, that isn't super important in practice, depending on who you talk to. So the first normal form says that each value is actually a value, and in particular is not a set of values. So you can't have a field that lists all phone numbers of someone, because a phone number is an entity and 5 phone numbers is not an entity. That's 5 entities. The second one is that every value that you have in a row has to depend on the entire primary key. And the third normal form says that every value that you have depends on the primary key and not an intermediate value. 2 and 3 get violated a lot on wikis that use Cargo. And I think I'm talking about that on a later slide. How static does a primary key need to be? I guess I talked about this on the previous slide, and I'm already halfway through time. So the important thing is that if you have a case where you're taking a primary key from one table and storing it in a second table so that you can join back to the first, you have to make sure that anytime the first is edited, the second is going to be blank edited, because otherwise you're going to have the data on the second page get out of date. And so if you're doing complicated things like this, where you have, and I'm joining 5 tables here, so it's somewhat complicated already. So originally I had the name, my ID, so the roster change ID, I had just the name of the page plus the line number. But I couldn't do a global line number here because I might add I might add a value earlier than that line number, then resave the page. Now my primary key is out of sync with what's stored in the child page. So that's something to always be careful about, is that if you're querying data from Cargo and then restoring, then blank editing is really, really important. Now, blank edit is when you update what Cargo has saved from the page, and you just press edit and then press save without doing anything. And you can just create a simple Python script or whatever language and run it in cron to blank edit stuff. You can make gadgets to blank edit stuff and have editors trained that they know that they have to click stuff. And this is similar to the idea of rebuilding SMW data daily, where you want to make sure that everything is refreshed. And I think my wiki has about 200,000 pages, so it's not an option to just daily rebuild everything. And people expect stuff to be updated within a couple minutes most of the time. So I definitely had to make sure that there were mechanisms in place for editors to be able to blank edit stuff on demand. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about something that is not standard. It makes no sense in SQL itself. And this is the idea of the zeroth normal form, which is a term that I coined a couple months ago. And it states that every primary key should yield a well-defined physical data location. So earlier I mentioned that the idea of an entity having a page becomes really important. And this is why. Because if you have a row of a table that you're storing and you don't know where it's coming from, and of course you can know where it's coming from because the page name field exists, but if you don't have a well-defined location that it's coming from, then in the case of having a red link, you can end up with data in weird places. And data being in weird places can very easily lead to losing single source of truth, and it can lead to having duplicated data. And it can lead to stuff getting out of sync. You can have old data that you thought you updated, but again, it's in two places. And if you're doing your queries with a group by, then it's possible you won't even notice that you have duplicate data, and it is really scary. So if you're ever working with a case where you want to store cargo data where the primary key is not guaranteed to exist, that's a really scary situation. And this is a case where, as an admin, you should actually say, okay, well, this is a very important thing, and I don't want to mess this up, because pretty much all your data integrity can go away if you violate this. So I'll give you an example violation, which I almost was considering, and then I guess that's when I coined this term, because I realized it is not okay. So I'm moving from a paradigm where I had current members of a team stored on team pages to having current members of a team stored on player pages. The issue with this is that I might have the team the information about players on a team for a team where the page exists, but the player page doesn't exist. And so how would I deal with this if I'm supposed to be storing the current player information from the player page, but no player page exists? Where do I store it from? And the answer is absolutely not the team page. Whatever you do, not the team page. It cannot be stored on the team page, because that would, again, lead to this zeroth normal form violation. Because what happens when someone creates the player page but forgets to update the team page, so the team page is still storing the data, and you can very easily get duplicated information, lose information. It's not good. So this is a case where the best practice, you actually really, really, really should follow this one. And I'm like kind of running out of time. So this is how the data page looks where I store the news table. And there's a small violation here, which you can see if there's too many items on a page. I think there was something like 500 items to be stored from that week, which was leading to about 1,200 cargo rows to be written, which is way too much for one page. So I split it up into 1 page per day instead of 1 page per week. Something like this is technically a zero normal form violation, but the navigation is very, very clear. If you're on a page where it's not split up by day, then you can see in the table of contents that you have all of the days here. And if it is split up, then the days are very clearly split here. And there's navigation within the nav box to be able to navigate to the specific day. So this is not really a well-defined mathematical principle the way that the actual normal forms are. So Zeroth normal form is maybe not the most appropriate name when you're looking at is it a mathematical definition or not. But it is really important. So you should definitely make every effort to follow it. And I'm just gonna skip over that slide because I have like no time left. So when you're querying data in Lua, so again, you can just query stuff from the wiki, and that's fine. You'll basically get an extension that works pretty similarly to SMW, and you'll be putting in structures that later can be extended better when you are writing Lua code, if that's something you're interested in. And you could cargo with wiki text is a lot harder to do stuff with than it is than cargo with Lua. One of the reasons for it is the ability to handle one-to-many relations. It's very hard to do that when you're just querying cargo from wiki text because there's not really a great way to compare a row to its neighbors. So if you want to say, okay, let me query all players on teams that placed in this tournament, grouped by team, and ordered by the place that they finished in, then you have to compare from one row to the next. Is the team the same? Is this the next player on the same team, or is this the first player on the next team? Do I have to make a new line in my table? What do I do? And that kind of comparison is really awkward to do in wiki text because you have to do stuff with variables, and you can try to cheat your way through with using Pageform's array map template and stuff like that. But it's really, really hard to do, and you end up with code that is very unreadable and impossible to maintain. But in Lua, it's pretty easy to do something like that. So these are best practices that you should try to follow in Lua. The first one is that basically your main function should be really short. And additionally, your main function should not use the frame object. It is very fine to have a 2-line long main function that's called from wiki text, and all you do is get the args from your frame object, and you don't touch the frame object anymore. Passing frame objects around leads to very confusing code, and I definitely recommend not doing it. Also in Lua, so cargo returns every single value as a string. And this can be not what you want if you want to do something like if you have a Boolean or if you have a number, it's not great to have string values returned. So you can totally just make a wrapper for cargo that does everything you want it to do. So in this case, you can see that my query has these fields, types, and one-to-many. And cargo, those aren't supported by cargo, but they are supported by my cargo wrapper, or my cargo query wrapper in Lua. So this is just the code for casting. I support Boolean, number, and namespace. And I have plans to support a bunch of custom types like champion, player, team, tournament, stuff like that. So it's totally fine so you should definitely make a wrapper for cargo. You should treat cargo like a third-party extension because it is. And you don't want to call third-party extensions embedded in your code all the time. I also find the syntax a little bit awkward to have tables and fields be separate parameters from the rest of the query. So in my wrapper, it just accepts a single table, and then the wrapper changes it to be tables, comma, fields, comma, other data. So I highly encourage you to create some cargo wrapper. You can, again, I have like all of this links in the speaker notes, so you can just copy what I have on my wiki. There's a lot of dependencies, but you can just copy those too and ignore them. That's really bad advice. Don't do that. Please, please don't do that. And so then I wanted to, I think, okay,
You're
yeah,
pretty close to being out of time.
okay.
And,
So,
Megan and I did talk before about handling questions during the Create Camp. So,
oh yeah, so if anyone has questions, I obviously have a lot of things that I can talk about. So I wanted to do that in the Create Camp instead. I'm totally happy to do a session on using Lua and Cargo together, or even just using Lua or just using Cargo. So I got through all of my Lua slides and I was like, oh, this is supposed to be when you don't have to use best practices. And I just said a bunch of practices that you really do have to use. So here's one that you're free to ignore. So this is not a good thing. You don't want to do this. You want to make output like this using the mw.html class. And you can see that you have literally no idea what I'm printing here in this make table function. There's no indication. There's no formatting. There's no information. There's no column names. All it is something that could be called from literally any function. And that's great because then you have all of your data is separated from the logic that you're doing. But it's also really hard to write code like this when you're not used to doing it this way. So if you want to just write like just concatenate a bunch of strings to give you wiki text output, that's fine. You're totally allowed to do this when you're learning Lua because it is a huge jump to start writing good Lua code. So don't even try starting to write good Lua code. Just write any Lua code. And just, yeah, have fun. So yeah, okay, that's the end of my slides. And again, there's so much more information in the speaker notes than what I got through saying. So definitely check out that if you're interested.
awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. And I have to say, I'm a huge proponent also of using Lua. I use it all the time and it's incredibly powerful. And a lot of the ideas that you had are right in line with the way I do things. So thank you. And I'm looking forward to talking about this more during the Create Camp.